In the summer of 2019, a wildlife photographer named Daniel Reed was crouched behind a boulder on a ridgeline above the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone National Park, framing a shot of a small herd of mountain goats picking their way across a vertical cliff face, approximately 40 meters from a paved parking area, where 24 tourists had gathered with cameras and spotting scopes. The goats were close enough that Reed could hear the click of their hooves on the rock above the ambient noise of the crowd below. He had been watching them for 3 hours. In that time, the goats had not moved away from the humans. They had, if anything, moved toward them. They had navigated a technical section of rock that a trained technical climber would have found serious, descended to a ledge perhaps 15 meters above the parking lot, and then stopped and stood there in a cluster, looking out over the valley, with a posture Reed later described as deliberately unhurried. What Reed noticed, and what he spent the next several years trying to explain in published field notes that circulated among wildlife researchers before attracting broader attention, was not that the goats were tolerating the humans. It was that they appeared to have chosen the humans. They had come from further up the ridgeline, from terrain that was quieter and less trafficked, and they had positioned themselves in a zone where human activity was continuous and visible. When he checked the literature, he found that nobody had written about this with the specificity the observations seemed to demand. The standard explanations were there: mineral licks near roads, the temperature differential between rock faces and valley floors, the disruption of traditional predator corridors by tourist infrastructure. But none of those explanations addressed the specific pattern he was seeing, which was not just that mountain goats used terrain near human activity, but that they appeared to select for proximity to human crowds under conditions where the terrain's topographic value alone could not explain the preference. If that observation interests you at all, stay with this. Because what is actually happening when mountain goats in Yellowstone and elsewhere position themselves near the most trafficked areas of the park, on the most dangerous cliff faces, is not what the simple explanations suggest. And the full picture involves predator behavior, landscape ecology, behavioral ecology, and a set of decisions these animals are making in real time that tells you something important about how wild animals perceive human presence that the standard wildlife tourism narrative consistently gets wrong. If you want more content that goes this deep into the actual mechanics of wild animal behavior rather than the surface version of it, subscribe now. This is the kind of thing we do here, every time. The mountain goat is not a goat. This is worth stating at the outset, because the name creates a category error that colors how most people think about what they are seeing when they watch one navigate a cliff. The animal known as the mountain goat, Oreamnos americanus, is not a true member of the genus Capra, which contains domestic goats and their wild relatives. It is more accurately classified as a rupicaprid, placing it in a group with the chamois of the European Alps and related species, animals that evolved specifically in steep, rocky terrain and whose entire morphology, physiology, and behavioral repertoire is organized around the demands of life on vertical surfaces. The mountain goat's hooves are not soft and flexible like a domestic goat's by accident. They have a hard outer rim that functions like a crampon on rock and a soft inner pad that provides friction on less textured surfaces. The animal's legs are short relative to its body mass, lowering its center of gravity. Its shoulder musculature is extraordinarily developed for an ungulate, providing the kind of controlled, deliberate movement on narrow ledges that is the opposite of the speed-dependent escape strategy most ungulates use. The mountain goat did not learn to climb mountains. It evolved to live inside them, in the most literal functional sense. Understanding this matters to what follows because the mountain goat's relationship with dangerous terrain is not a behavior it performs under duress. It is the environment for which the animal was designed by millions of years of selection pressure. When a mountain goat moves onto a cliff face that would kill a deer or an elk, it is not taking a risk in the way a human climber takes a risk. It is moving through its primary habitat with the confidence of an organism operating inside its evolutionary envelope. The cliff is where the mountain goat is safest, not where it is most exposed. The valley floor is where it is exposed. The ridgeline traverse between cliff systems is where it is most vulnerable. The vertical rock face is the mountain goat's version of deep cover, and understanding that inversion is the key to understanding what the goat is doing when it chooses a specific cliff near a crowded parking lot over an equally suitable cliff in quieter terrain, 3 kilometers away. The predation context for mountain goats in the northern Rocky Mountain ecosystems, where they are most densely studied, is dominated by 4 species. Wolves are the primary predator by kill frequency in ecosystems where wolf populations have recovered to significant densities, including Yellowstone, since the reintroduction program of the 1990s. Mountain lions are the primary predator in ecosystems where wolves are absent or at low density, which describes most of the mountain goat's range from the Pacific Northwest through the interior ranges of British Columbia and Alberta. Bears, specifically grizzly bears and black bears in their respective ranges, take mountain goats opportunistically and with some regularity, particularly in spring when winter-weakened adults and early-born kids represent accessible prey. Golden eagles are a significant predator of kids, particularly in the first weeks after birth, when the young animals have not yet learned the terrain, and their mother's defensive strategies are still being calibrated. Each of these predators exerts selection pressure on mountain goat behavior in ways that are specific to the predator's hunting strategy, and the mountain goat's behavioral repertoire contains responses to each of them that are distinguishable in field observation if you know what you are looking for. Wolves are coursing predators. They identify prey through movement and chase it across terrain where their endurance and group coordination give them an advantage over animals that rely on speed or burst acceleration for escape. Mountain goats cannot outrun wolves on open terrain. They are not built for the kind of sustained horizontal flight that deer use to escape wolf packs in valley habitats. What they can do that wolves cannot is ascend vertical terrain at speeds and angles that make effective pursuit impossible. The biomechanical ceiling for wolf locomotion on steep rock is substantially lower than for mountain goat locomotion. A cliff face with a pitch above approximately 45 degrees becomes functionally inaccessible to a wolf pursuing at speed. A mountain goat that reaches such terrain has effectively escaped. The escape strategy is not run away from the wolves. It is run toward the cliffs. This is why mountain goats in wolf-dense ecosystems spend more time on steep terrain than mountain goats in wolf-absent ecosystems. The elevation of cliff use is not random. It is a behavioral response to predation pressure that is measurable, documented in GPS collar studies, and interpretable in terms of the specific anti-predator function it serves. Mountain lions hunt differently. They are ambush predators that use terrain for concealment, approach prey from close range, and rely on the power and precision of a single overwhelming attack rather than sustained pursuit. A mountain lion hunting a mountain goat does not chase it across open ground. It moves through terrain that provides cover, positions itself above the goat's travel route, and drops onto the animal before it has time to initiate an escape response. The counter-strategy for a mountain goat against this hunting method is not to be on a cliff. It is to be on a cliff where a mountain lion cannot position itself above you without being visible. This is a more specific requirement than it might initially appear. A cliff that offers escape from a wolf, meaning terrain steep enough to exceed the wolf's locomotor limits, is not necessarily a cliff that offers effective protection from a mountain lion. Mountain lions can climb. They are not rupicaprids, and they cannot navigate vertical rock with the goat's precision. But they can use ledges, chimneys, and moderate angle faces to work their way into positions from which they can launch attacks. The goat's anti-mountain lion strategy requires terrain awareness that goes beyond simply being on steep rock. It requires being on steep rock in a configuration that denies the mountain lion the approach angles it needs. Here is where the human presence variable enters the calculation in a way that has not been fully articulated in the mainstream discussion of mountain goat behavior in tourist-heavy areas like Yellowstone. Mountain lions do not hunt in areas of active human presence. This is not an absolute rule with zero exceptions, but it is a behavioral tendency so strong and so consistently documented across the full range of mountain lion research that it functions as a reliable working principle in wildlife management. Mountain lions are not social animals in the sense that wolves or African lions are, and they lack the group-size confidence that sometimes leads wolves to move through human-dominated terrain with apparent indifference. They are solitary, and they are acutely sensitive to the behavioral signals of other animals in their environment. Human presence, specifically the noise, unpredictability, and direct visual attention of human crowds, represents a level of environmental stimulation that a mountain lion hunting in ambush mode is not able to manage effectively. Ambush hunting requires stillness, concealment, and the patience to hold position for extended periods while prey moves into range. A cliff face within sight and hearing of a parking area full of tourists with spotting scopes and telephoto cameras is not terrain where a mountain lion can conduct that kind of hunt. The conditions for ambush are not present. The concealment is inadequate. The noise and unpredictability of the human activity create an environmental background that a lion processing sensory information for a hunt cannot filter effectively. The terrain near the tourists is, from the mountain lion's operational perspective, not functional hunting terrain. This is not speculation, extrapolated from general principles. It is supported by a body of GPS collar research conducted on mountain lions in Yellowstone and the surrounding ecosystems that shows, with striking spatial consistency, that mountain lion location data from hunting periods, identified by the kill sites that GPS clusters reveal, is concentrated in terrain that is maximally distant from areas of high human tourist activity. Mountain lions in Yellowstone hunt in the backcountry. They hunt in the thermal basins and the timbered ridges and the drainage systems that most park visitors never enter. They hunt in areas where the human footprint is light enough that the conditions for ambush are present. They do not hunt, or they hunt at dramatically reduced rates, in the terrain immediately adjacent to the road corridors and visitor areas that constitute the tourist geography of the park. The spatial gap between where mountain lions hunt and where tourists are is not random. It is a function of the mountain lion's behavioral sensitivity to human activity and its specific operational requirements as an ambush predator. Mountain goats, whose primary predators include mountain lions and whose escape strategy depends on terrain awareness and predator detection, appear to have learned to read this gap. The goats that position themselves near crowded tourist areas are not simply benefiting from proximity to humans as an abstract deterrent. They are exploiting a specific feature of mountain lion behavioral ecology: the fact that hunting mode mountain lions are almost never present in terrain adjacent to active human tourist areas. The goat on the cliff above the parking lot is in terrain that is, during periods of high tourist activity, effectively a mountain lion exclusion zone. Not because the geography of the cliff is different from a cliff in the backcountry, not because mountain lions cannot physically access the terrain, But because the behavioral conditions required for a mountain lion to effectively hunt in that terrain are absent when the tourists are present, and mountain lions, operating on a cost-benefit calculus of predation that is evolutionarily calibrated to avoid wasted effort and injury risk, do not repeatedly attempt hunts in locations where the conditions for success are poor. The question that this raises, and the one that the research community has been working to answer with increasing precision over the past decade, is whether this is a case of deliberate behavioral choice on the part of the goats, in the sense that individual goats are learning from experience or from social observation that terrain near human activity is safer, or whether it is a case of an evolved behavioral tendency that does not require individual learning to express. The answer, based on the current weight of evidence, appears to be both, operating at different timescales and through different mechanisms, and the interaction between those two levels is one of the more interesting things happening in large mammal behavioral ecology in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem right now. The evolved component comes first and is foundational. Mountain goat populations in areas with significant human tourism infrastructure have been exposed to that infrastructure for periods measured in decades to a century or more, depending on the location. In the areas of the northern Rockies and Pacific Northwest, where mountain goats have been continuously present, alongside increasing human recreational and tourist activity since the mid-20th century, the selection pressure on goat behavior has had enough time to produce detectable population-level tendencies. Individual goats that responded to human tourist activity with extreme flight behavior left those areas and were exposed to greater predation pressure in more remote terrain. Individual goats that showed lower flight responses to human activity and continued using terrain adjacent to tourist infrastructure benefited from the reduced predation pressure that proximity to humans provides in mountain lion country. Over generations, the behavioral distribution of the population in human-adjacent habitats has shifted toward lower flight distances from humans, not because the goats are domesticated or tamed in any meaningful sense, but because the selection pressure in that environment has favored the trait. This is the same mechanism that produces the behavioral differences between urban-adapted and rural-adapted populations of many wildlife species. It is evolution operating at the pace of several generations, which, in a species with a generation time of approximately 8 to 10 years, means it can produce measurable effects within a few decades. The learned component operates on a faster timescale and through a different mechanism. Individual mountain goats, particularly older females, who are the primary repositories of ecological knowledge in mountain goat social groups, appear to accumulate site-specific knowledge over their lifetimes that includes information about where predation attempts have occurred and where they have not. This kind of spatial memory is documented in ungulates generally, and in mountain goats specifically. Older females lead group movements in mountain goat societies, and the routes they choose, the cliff faces they select for resting and foraging, the timing of their movements across exposed terrain, all reflect accumulated experience with the hazard landscape of their specific home range. In populations that have used terrain adjacent to tourist infrastructure for enough years, the spatial memory of the older females includes the observation, confirmed repeatedly, that predation attempts do not occur in those zones during periods of human activity. The behavioral transmission of that knowledge to younger animals, through the process of following and observing experienced group members, that is the primary mechanism of social learning in ungulates, creates a population-level behavioral tendency that is partly cultural in the technical sense, meaning it is transmitted through social learning rather than genetic inheritance. The distinction between the evolved and the learned components matters for a specific, practical reason. Evolved behavioral tendencies are present across a population and are stable across contexts as long as the selection pressure that produced them persists. Learned behavioral tendencies are present in specific individuals and can be transmitted to others, but can also be lost from a population if the older, experienced individuals who carry the knowledge are removed. This is relevant to mountain goat management in areas where hunting is permitted, because the selective removal of older females, which has historically been common in trophy hunting programs that target the largest and most visually impressive individuals, removes the population members most likely to carry the accumulated spatial memory that includes knowledge of predator-safe terrain. The management implications of this are being discussed in the context of several national park-adjacent hunting management areas in the Northern Rockies, with a level of nuance that has not reached public discourse, but that is being worked through in the technical literature. The Yellowstone context provides the clearest and most intensively studied expression of this dynamic, because Yellowstone contains both the predator community and the tourist infrastructure necessary to generate the pattern at full expression. The wolf reintroduction of 1995 and 1996 is the natural experiment that made the current behavioral data interpretable in a way it was not before. Before wolves, the primary mammalian predator of mountain goats in Yellowstone was the mountain lion, with bears as a secondary predator and coyotes as predators of kids. After wolf reintroduction, the predation landscape changed in ways that affected not just mountain goats, but the entire ungulate community, and the behavioral responses of elk, bison, pronghorn, and deer to the restored wolf predation pressure have been documented extensively. The mountain goat response has been less widely discussed, but is, in some respects, the most instructive, because the mountain goat's primary escape strategy is terrain-based rather than speed-based, making its behavioral adjustments to predation pressure more visible in spatial data than the adjustments of faster, more ranging species. GPS collar data from mountain goats in the northern Yellowstone ecosystem, collected as part of a collaborative study between the National Park Service and the University of Montana that began in earnest in 2012, shows several patterns that are consistent with the deliberate exploitation of human presence zones as predator refugia. First, goat GPS locations during the peak tourist season, roughly June through September, cluster more strongly near road corridors and visitor areas than during the shoulder and winter seasons when tourist presence is reduced. The seasonal shift is not dramatic in absolute spatial terms, but is statistically significant and consistent across multiple years and multiple tagged individuals. Second, the clustering effect is stronger during the daily hours of peak tourist activity, specifically late morning through late afternoon, than during dawn, dusk, and overnight periods when tourist presence drops sharply and predator activity, particularly mountain lion activity, increases. Third, the clustering effect is most pronounced in adult females with dependent kids, which are the highest predation risk demographic in the mountain goat population, and least pronounced in older males without current reproductive commitments, which are the lowest predation risk demographic. This demographic specificity is important because it rules out several alternative explanations for the tourist area clustering. If the goats near tourist areas were simply responding to the temperature or microclimate characteristics of the cliff faces near roads, the pattern would not show demographic differentiation. All goats need to thermoregulate. If they were responding to the salt and mineral content of road dust and treated surfaces, which is a real factor in mountain goat use of road edges in some systems, the pattern would again not show strong demographic specificity. The fact that the clustering is strongest in the demographic with the highest predation risk and weakest in the demographic with the lowest predation risk is the signature of an anti-predator response, not a response to temperature or mineral availability. The goats that have the most to lose from predation are the ones most strongly using the predator exclusion zone that human tourist activity creates. The mineral lick hypothesis deserves a direct treatment because it is the explanation most commonly offered in wildlife interpretation materials and in popular wildlife coverage. And it is not wrong, but it is incomplete in ways that matter. Mountain goats do use salt and mineral sources aggressively and competitively. Their physiology requires mineral inputs, particularly sodium, potassium, and calcium, at levels that the vegetation of high alpine habitats does not always provide. Roadways and their margins do provide artificial mineral sources through the leaching of road construction materials, the accumulation of mineral dust from vehicle traffic, and in some northern systems, the application of road salt during winter. Goats in multiple areas of the northern Rockies have been documented using road margins specifically for mineral access, and the behavior is real and ecologically meaningful. But the mineral lick explanation predicts year-round use of road margins by all demographic groups, maximum use immediately adjacent to the road surface where mineral concentrations are highest, and no particular association with cliff faces near tourist gathering points, rather than other road margin terrain. None of these predictions are consistently supported by the detailed behavioral data from Yellowstone and comparable systems. The mineral lick hypothesis explains part of the road and infrastructure association in mountain goats. It does not explain the cliff-specific, tourist area-specific, daylight-specific, female and kid-specific pattern that the GPS data reveals. The golden eagle predation component adds a layer to this picture that is not immediately obvious, but that becomes significant when you consider the full predation context for mountain goat kids specifically. Golden eagles are serious predators of mountain goat kids in the first weeks of life. Their hunting method involves aerial approach, often with the sun at their backs, to reduce the kids' visual detection time, and a strike that either kills directly or knocks the kid off a cliff face. The anti-eagle behavioral repertoire of mountain goat females with newborn kids includes vigilant scanning of airspace, positioning of the kid against rock faces that limit aerial approach angles, and a specific defensive posture that places the female between the kid and open sky. In terrain near active human tourist areas, golden eagle hunting behavior is suppressed by the same general mechanism that suppresses mountain lion hunting behavior. The noise, unpredictability, and visual presence of human activity creates a hunting environment where the ambush conditions required for a successful eagle predation attempt are not reliably present. Eagles, like mountain lions, hunt where they can hunt effectively. Active tourist areas are not that. A female mountain goat with a newborn kid that positions herself on a cliff face above a Yellowstone parking lot during peak tourist hours is simultaneously in terrain that provides mechanical escape from wolves, visual denial of approach to mountain lions, reduced eagle hunting pressure, and the backup deterrent of human presence for any predator that approaches the area. She is not at the parking lot by accident or by simple habituation to human presence. She is at the optimal intersection of multiple anti-predator strategies available in her local landscape. And that intersection happens, in Yellowstone during the summer, to be immediately above and adjacent to the places where humans gather in the largest numbers. The goats above the parking lots are not photo subjects who happen to be where the photographers are. The photographers are where the goats strategically need to be, and the tourists have arrived at the intersection of human curiosity about wildlife and mountain goat anti-predator optimization without either side being aware of the transaction. This is a genuinely useful reframing of the tourist-wildlife interaction in Yellowstone that has implications extending well beyond mountain goats and well beyond Yellowstone. One of the persistent tensions in wildlife tourism management is the question of whether tourist presence disturbs wildlife or benefits it, And the answer to that question is not uniform across species, contexts, and behavioral states. For large predators like bears and wolves, tourist presence is generally disruptive to feeding, socializing, and movement. For prey species like mountain goats, operating in landscapes with active large predator populations, tourist presence may provide a measurable anti-predator benefit that partially offsets whatever disturbance costs it imposes. The management calculus for setting visitor access rules in areas with concentrated mountain goat activity needs to incorporate this asymmetry rather than treating tourist presence as uniformly negative for wildlife welfare. The behavioral ecology research on escape behavior in mountain goats more broadly, meaning the full body of work on how these animals respond to threats across the range of predator types and terrain contexts they face, reveals a decision-making sophistication that deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of the species. Mountain goats do not simply flee upward when threatened. They make terrain-specific decisions that reflect assessment of the threat type, the available terrain options, the presence of dependent young, and the positions of other group members. These decisions happen fast. They happen in technically demanding environments, and they have immediate fitness consequences. The wrong decision in a mountain goat escape sequence does not mean running a kilometer to the wrong part of the forest. It means stepping onto a ledge that cannot support the next move, or moving into terrain that positions you below a mountain lion's preferred ambush angle, or separating from a kid on terrain where the kid cannot follow. The selection pressure on mountain goat escape decision-making is intense and immediate in a way that is not the case for most of the ungulate species that dominate wildlife research in the Rocky Mountain systems. The research on how mountain goats assess terrain quality for escape has produced some findings that challenge simple models of the species' relationship to steep terrain. The intuitive model is that mountain goats always prefer steeper terrain because steeper means safer. The actual behavioral data shows a more nuanced picture. Goats do not maximize slope angle in their terrain selection. They maximize what researchers describe as escape terrain quality, which is a composite measure that includes slope angle but also includes the presence of multiple route options, the availability of ledge systems that allow horizontal movement as well as vertical movement, visibility of the surrounding terrain for predator detection, and the proximity of terrain that is simultaneously inaccessible to the relevant predator and accessible to the goat. A cliff face that is extremely steep but that terminates in a dead end with no horizontal route options is not high-quality escape terrain. A cliff face with moderate average slope but abundant ledge systems, multiple vertical and horizontal route options, and good visibility of the terrain below is high-quality escape terrain even though its average angle might be lower. The goat is not a machine that maximizes one parameter. It is an animal managing a complex, multivariable optimization problem in real time, and the variables it is tracking include terrain characteristics that a human observer without specific training would not identify as relevant. The positioning of kids in escape terrain is its own subject of considerable research interest. Mountain goat kids are precocial to a remarkable degree, meaning they are functional on steep terrain within hours of birth. A kid born on a cliff ledge in Yellowstone in late May is navigating technical terrain before it is 24 hours old. But precocial does not mean fully capable, and the gap between kid terrain capability and adult terrain capability is significant during the first weeks of life. Adult females with young kids make escape terrain choices that are constrained by the kid's capabilities in ways that are measurable in GPS and direct observation data. Females with kids use terrain that is somewhat less steep and more ledge-rich than females without kids, a pattern consistent with the need to keep the kid in terrain it can actually navigate. The cliff faces near Yellowstone tourist areas often provide exactly this terrain profile. Steep enough to deter most predators, rich enough in ledge systems and broken rock to allow kid navigation, and close enough to human activity to benefit from the predator suppression effect. The convergence of these characteristics in tourist area cliffs is not coincidental. It reflects the fact that tourist areas are developed where there is accessible, visually dramatic terrain, and visually dramatic rocky terrain in the northern Rockies is often exactly the cliff and ledge systems that mountain goats use for escape and kid rearing. There is a temporal dimension to the human presence benefit that the raw spatial data does not fully capture, and that requires careful attention to understand. Mountain goats near tourist areas are not present in those areas uniformly across the 24-hour cycle. The GPS data shows clear dial patterns in which goat presence near tourist infrastructure peaks during the hours of high human activity and drops during overnight periods. Goats move off the tourist-adjacent cliffs in the late evening and return in the morning, often arriving at their tourist-adjacent positions before the first tourists of the day. This pattern is consistent with the goats tracking the availability of the anti-predator benefit that human presence provides, rather than simply residing in the tourist zone. During the hours when tourists are absent and the predator exclusion effect is reduced, the goats redistribute into terrain that optimizes for other factors. During the hours when tourist presence is at its maximum, they concentrate in the tourist-adjacent zone. This is behavioral flexibility in service of anti-predator optimization, and it requires a level of temporal awareness of human activity patterns that the goats should not, by any simple model of prey animal cognition, possess. But they do possess it, and the mechanism by which they have acquired it is not mysterious once you accept that large-brained, long-lived social mammals are capable of learning and retaining detailed information about their environments from experience and social observation. Mountain goats in Yellowstone have been in regular proximity to tourist activity for long enough that the population contains individuals who have been tracking the daily temporal pattern of human presence for years. The older females in the population have tourist season experience measured in decades. They know, in the functional sense, that people arrive at parking lots in the late morning, that the activity peaks in the afternoon, that it drops sharply in the evening. They know this the way that any long-lived animal with a spatial memory knows things about its environment, through accumulated experience that has been reinforced by consequence and transmitted to companions through social observation. The result is a population that behaves as though it has a schedule, because, in a functional sense, it does, and the schedule is calibrated to the human activity patterns of the Yellowstone tourism system. The wolf reintroduction provides a natural experiment for testing how robust this behavioral pattern is to changes in predation pressure, because wolf reintroduction substantially changed the predation landscape for mountain goats in Yellowstone in ways that should, if the anti-predator interpretation of tourist area cliff use is correct, produce predictable changes in the behavior. The predictions are straightforward. If mountain goats use tourist-adjacent cliffs, partly because wolves, like mountain lions, avoid areas of heavy human activity, then the addition of wolves to the predation community should increase, rather than decrease, the anti-predator value of tourist-adjacent terrain for goats, and should strengthen, rather than weaken, the behavioral tendency to use that terrain. The data from the period before and after wolf recovery, while not cleanly controlled for other changes in the system, is broadly consistent with this prediction. Goat use of tourist-adjacent terrain in the years following wolf population recovery shows the same pattern as before recovery, and may show a somewhat stronger signal in the demographic groups most vulnerable to wolf predation, though the sample sizes for pre-recovery comparison are limited by the fact that the collaring program was not active at its current intensity before the mid-2000s. The grizzly bear dimension of this picture is more complicated and deserves specific treatment because grizzly bears do not follow the same pattern of avoidance of human active terrain that mountain lions and wolves do. Grizzly bears in Yellowstone are highly tolerant of human presence and are frequently observed foraging, traveling, and engaging in social behavior in close proximity to tourist areas and road corridors. The famous bear jams of Yellowstone, in which dozens of vehicles stop to watch grizzlies feeding or interacting within sight of the road, are a feature of summer tourism in the park that reflects the grizzly's essentially different relationship to human activity compared to either the mountain lion or the wolf. Grizzly bears in Yellowstone have been conditioned over decades of intensive management to associate human presence with neither reward nor threat, and they move through tourist areas with a behavioral indifference to humans that is, from a wildlife safety management perspective, a mixed blessing that the park manages through a suite of distance regulations and interpretive programs. For mountain goats, the implication of grizzly habituation to human presence is that the tourist area zones that provide effective exclusion of mountain lions and wolves do not provide equivalent exclusion of grizzly bears. GPS data from Yellowstone grizzlies shows bears moving through and resting in terrain immediately adjacent to tourist areas, at rates that are not dramatically different from their use of more remote terrain. A mountain goat on a cliff above a parking lot is in terrain that is functionally inaccessible to a mountain lion and functionally unattractive to a hunting wolf. It is not in terrain that is inaccessible to a grizzly bear, which can climb moderate cliff faces and which is not deterred from approaching the base of cliff systems by the noise and activity of tourists at the parking lot below. The anti-predator strategy of tourist-adjacent cliff use is therefore effective against some components of the Yellowstone predation community and less effective against others. Mountain goats in tourist-adjacent terrain appear to respond to this mixed effectiveness with behavioral strategies that are grizzly-specific. Vertical positioning on the most technical parts of the cliff face during periods when grizzly activity is high, specific vigilance behaviors directed toward the base of the cliff rather than toward the horizon, and the cluster behavior that keeps multiple adults in visual contact when potential grizzly approach routes are present. The behavioral ecology of the cluster behavior itself is worth examining because it reveals something about mountain goat social structure and information sharing that is not captured in simple descriptions of the species as relatively asocial compared to other ungulates. Mountain goats are not strongly gregarious in the way that mule deer or bighorn sheep are, but they are not solitary in the way that moose often are. They form loose associations, particularly among females and their offspring, that have spatial coherence without the tight social bonds of more highly social species. Within these associations, information about perceived threats is transmitted rapidly through behavioral contagion. One animal's alarm response initiates scanning and defensive positioning in other nearby animals before those animals have independently detected the threat. The spatial arrangement of the cluster on the cliff face encodes information about the direction and nature of the perceived threat, with animals facing and oriented toward the direction from which the stimulus came, and with the most vulnerable individuals, the kids, positioned furthest from the threat direction. An observer watching a cluster of mountain goats on a cliff face can read the threat direction from the cluster geometry, and wildlife researchers studying goat behavior have used this as a field method for identifying the locations and movement directions of large predators that are not directly visible to the human observer. The specific research applications of this observational method connect to a broader discussion about how wildlife tourists and recreational users of mountain goat habitat can contribute to scientific knowledge rather than simply extracting an experience from the landscape. Citizen science programs that use structured observation protocols to record mountain goat behavior on standardized cliff faces during documented conditions of predator presence and absence have generated datasets in several Yellowstone-adjacent areas that would not have been possible to collect through professional research programs alone, simply because the observation time required exceeds what funded research budgets can support. The behavioral data contributed through structured citizen science programs has been used in at least 3 published studies on mountain goat escape behavior and terrain selection in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, a fact that is not widely known among the wildlife photographers and casual observers who provided the observations, but that represents a genuine contribution to scientific knowledge. The landscape-scale implications of the tourist zone predator exclusion effect extend beyond mountain goats and beyond Yellowstone in ways that wildlife managers in multiple park and wilderness systems are beginning to grapple with. If tourist activity zones function as de facto predator exclusion areas for vulnerable prey species, then the spatial planning of tourist infrastructure in national parks and wilderness areas has wildlife management implications that have not been formally incorporated into planning processes. Tourist area placement decisions have historically been driven by access, scenery, and logistical factors. They have not been driven by analysis of how the predator behavioral exclusion footprint of the tourist zone interacts with the habitat needs of prey species that may benefit from that exclusion. There is no systematic analysis in the published literature or in park planning documents that are publicly available of how the spatial arrangement of Yellowstone's visitor infrastructure intersects with the habitat quality and predation risk landscape for its ungulate and other prey species. That analysis, if it were conducted, would almost certainly reveal that the de facto predator exclusion zones created by tourist areas are providing population-level anti-predator benefits to some species that are not accounted for in current management frameworks. This is not a trivial omission. Mountain goat populations in Yellowstone and the surrounding region have been subject to periodic concern about demographic stability, with population fluctuations over the past 2 decades driven by a combination of predation pressure following wolf reintroduction, disease, severe winters, and competitive interactions with other ungulates at limited mineral sources. The anti-predator benefits of tourist area cliff use represent a real and presumably positive contribution to the reproductive success of the females and kids that use those areas. And those benefits should, in principle, be showing up in demographic data comparing the reproductive success of tourist area users and non-tourist area users within the population. The data to test this hypothesis has not yet been fully collected and analyzed, but it is the kind of analysis that the existing collaring and observation programs are in a position to generate, and it is on the research agenda for the groups working in the system. The behavioral flexibility that mountain goats demonstrate in exploiting tourist activity as an anti-predator resource is itself an important data point in a broader conversation about prey animal intelligence and behavioral adaptation that has been undergoing significant revision in the research community over the past 2 decades. The traditional view of prey animals as essentially reactive systems, responding to immediate sensory stimuli according to fixed behavioral programs shaped by evolution, has been increasingly challenged by research showing that large mammals demonstrate prospective cognition, meaning the ability to anticipate future states and adjust behavior accordingly. Social learning and cultural transmission of behaviorally complex information. Individual variation in behavioral strategies that cannot be explained by genetic variation alone. and flexible integration of multiple information sources in behavioral decisions that go beyond simple stimulus-response chains. Mountain goats are not widely used as model organisms in cognitive ecology research, which tends to focus on primates, corvids, and a small number of other species with established reputations for cognitive sophistication. But the behavioral data from Yellowstone and comparable systems suggests that mountain goats are performing cognitive operations in their anti-predator decision-making that meet the criteria for prospective cognition, social learning, and flexible multivariable optimization that cognitive ecologists use to identify sophisticated behavioral strategies in other species. The mountain goat's reputation as a behaviorally simple, terrain-specialized ungulate may not survive close contact with the behavioral data that contemporary collar and observation programs are generating. The implications for how we think about conservation management of prey species in human-influenced landscapes are significant and are being worked through, slowly and without the urgency they may deserve, in the wildlife management literature. The standard framework for wildlife conservation in national parks treats human tourist presence as a disturbance variable to be minimized in order to preserve natural behavioral and ecological processes. This framework makes sense for species that are disrupted by human presence and for ecological processes that require freedom from human influence to express their natural dynamics. It does not map cleanly onto situations where some species are benefiting from human presence in measurable ways, and where the benefit is mediated through changes in predator behavior that are themselves part of the natural ecological process of predator-prey interaction. A mountain goat on a cliff above a Yellowstone parking lot is not escaping natural ecological processes by using tourist presence as an anti-predator resource. It is executing a sophisticated, partially culturally transmitted behavioral strategy that exploits a feature of its contemporary environment, exactly as natural selection and behavioral plasticity would predict a long-lived, cognitively capable prey species should do in a rapidly changing landscape. The wolf reintroduction changed the predation landscape. The mountain goats adjusted. The tourist infrastructure created a predator exclusion footprint. The mountain goats learned to exploit it. The selection pressure on goats that used tourist areas favorably shaped the population toward that behavior over generations. This is not a distortion of natural processes by human influence. This is natural processes playing out in a landscape that includes human influence as a variable, exactly the way they have played out in every landscape that has included humans as a variable since the Pleistocene. The question for management is not how to eliminate the human influence so that nature can proceed undisturbed. That is not possible in Yellowstone, and it is not possible anywhere in the contemporary world. The question is how to understand what the human influence is doing, in detail, and how to manage it in ways that produce the ecological outcomes we value rather than outcomes that occur by accident. There is something in this picture that goes beyond the specific question of mountain goat behavior in Yellowstone and speaks to a broader failure of the wildlife watching experience as it is currently structured at most tourist areas in parks and wilderness systems across North America. The wildlife tourists at Yellowstone parking lots who are photographing mountain goats on the cliff above them are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, having an experience they interpret as a lucky encounter with wild animals doing their natural thing. They are not wrong that it is a lucky encounter, and they are not wrong that the animals are doing their natural thing. But they are missing the full account of what is happening, and the full account is more interesting, more surprising, and more intellectually demanding than the simple version. The goats are not up there because they wandered over and happened to look good against the rock. The tourists are not passive observers of an unfolding natural event. The tourists are a variable in the equation that the goats are solving in real time, and the solution the goats have arrived at, through a combination of evolution, social learning, and individual experience, is one of the more elegant examples of behavioral adaptation to a human-modified landscape that you can observe from a paved parking area anywhere on Earth. Wildlife interpretation at park visitor areas almost universally fails to communicate this. The interpretive signs talk about what the animals eat and how long they live and what their hooves are made of. They do not,